Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey to the sun-scorched shores of ancient Crete, to a time when gods walked among mortals and the line between human ambition and divine punishment was perilously thin. Get cozy, settle in, and let me tell you a story about wings made of wax and feathers, about a father's desperate ingenuity, and about a boy who dared to touch the sun. This is the tale of Icarus. The story of Icarus has echoed through millennia, whispered in classrooms and painted on countless canvases, referenced in poetry and psychology, in boardrooms and therapy sessions. It has become more than myth. It has become metaphor. When we speak of flying too close to the sun, we invoke Icarus without even realizing it. His name has become synonymous with overreaching ambition, with the reckless abandon of youth, with the terrible price of ignoring wisdom. Yet, for all its familiarity, for all the times this tale has been told, there remains something haunting in its simplicity. A father and son fleeing imprisonment, a moment of joy turning to tragedy, feathers scattered on dark water. Before we can understand the fall, we must first understand the flight. And before we can understand the flight, we must travel back to the island of Crete, to a time when that island was the beating heart of Mediterranean power, when its palaces gleamed with frescoes of bulls and dancers, when its kings commanded fleets that ruled the waves. This was the world into which our story was born, a world of mazes and monsters, of ancient secrets buried deep beneath stone floors, of craftsmen whose skills seemed touched by something beyond the merely human. Crete in the age of myth was no ordinary place. It was the jewel of the Aegean, the island of King Minos, a ruler whose very name would become synonymous with both justice and cruelty. Minos was said to be the son of Zeus himself, born of the union between the king of gods and Europa, a Phoenician princess whom Zeus had abducted in the form of a magnificent white bull. Every 9 years, Minos would ascend to a sacred cave on Mount Ida, there to commune with his divine father and receive instruction on how to govern his kingdom. The laws he brought down from those mountain conferences were considered holy, beyond question, crafted with divine wisdom. Yet for all his connection to Zeus, for all the grandeur of his palace at Knossos with its twisting corridors and painted walls, Minos carried a darkness that no amount of divine favor could erase. His story was tangled with betrayal, with unnatural desires, with monsters born from punishment and pride. When Poseidon, god of the sea, had sent him a magnificent white bull as a sign of divine approval, Minos had been meant to sacrifice it. The animal was so beautiful, so perfect in form that Minos could not bring himself to do it. He kept the bull for himself and sacrificed another in its place. The gods do not forget such slights. Poseidon's vengeance was subtle and terrible. He caused Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, to fall madly in love with the bull. Her desire was unnatural, impossible, agonizing. In her desperation, she turned to the only man on Crete clever enough to help her, a craftsman from Athens, an exile with hands that could shape wonders. His name was Daedalus. What Daedalus built for Pasiphae defies easy description. Some sources call it a hollow cow, others a wooden frame covered in hide. Whatever its form, it allowed the queen to consummate her impossible passion. 9 months later, she gave birth to a creature that was both blessing and curse, a being with the body of a man and the head of a bull. They called him Asterion, but history would remember him by another name, the Minotaur. King Minos, horrified by this living reminder of divine punishment and his own pride, knew the creature could not be allowed to roam free. As it grew, so did its appetite for human flesh. It became savage, uncontrollable, a danger to everyone in the palace. And so Minos once again turned to Daedalus. This time the task was even more ambitious. Daedalus was commissioned to build a prison from which escape would be impossible, a structure so complex that even its creator would struggle to find his way out. He was to build the Labyrinth. The Labyrinth of Knossos became legendary even in ancient times. Poets described it as a maze of endless corridors, of passages that doubled back on themselves, of doorways that led nowhere, and staircases that climbed into darkness. Some said it was carved deep into the earth beneath the palace, others that it sprawled across multiple levels, a vertical puzzle as well as a horizontal one. Archaeological evidence suggests that the palace of Knossos itself, with its 1,000 rooms and winding hallways, may have inspired the legend. But in myth, the labyrinth was something more than architecture. It was a symbol of confusion, of entrapment, of the impossibility of escape. Into this maze, Minos placed the Minotaur, and to feed it he demanded tribute from Athens. The city had fallen to Crete in war after the death of Minos' son Androgeos on Athenian soil. The price of peace was blood. Every 9 years, or in some versions every year, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. These tributes were released into the labyrinth, one by one, to wander until they met the Minotaur in the dark. This went on for years. The labyrinth filled with bones. The Minotaur grew fat on Athenian youth, until one year, a prince named Theseus volunteered to be among the tributes. He came not as a victim, but as a hunter, determined to slay the beast and end the cycle of sacrifice. And when he arrived in Crete, he caught the eye of someone unexpected, Ariadne, daughter of Minos, half-sister to the monster in the maze. Ariadne fell in love with Theseus, and love made her bold. She knew her father would never willingly reveal the secret of the labyrinth, but she also knew that one man on Crete understood its every turn and twist. She went to Daedalus, the architect of the maze, and begged him for help. What he gave her was elegantly simple, a ball of thread. Theseus would unwind it as he ventured deeper into the labyrinth, leaving a path he could follow back to the entrance once the Minotaur was dead. The plan worked. Theseus killed the beast, followed the thread back to freedom, and sailed away with Ariadne and the other Athenian youths. For a brief moment, he was a hero, but his triumph would become someone else's tragedy. To understand what happened next, we must step back and truly understand the man at the center of this tale. Daedalus was not simply a craftsman. He was not merely skilled with his hands. Ancient sources describe him as something approaching divine in his abilities, a mortal who could create things that seemed touched by the gods themselves. His statues were said to move, to walk, to possess a lifelike quality that made observers chain them down lest they wander off. His inventions included the saw, the axe, the compass used in drafting. He was sculptor, architect, engineer, and inventor all at once. But genius often comes paired with darker impulses, and Daedalus was no exception. He had been born in Athens, into a noble family descended from the ancient kings of that city. His workshop in the district of Metis became famous throughout the Greek world. Young men came from across Attica to apprentice with him, to learn his techniques, to perhaps grasp even a fraction of his skill. Among these apprentices was his nephew, a boy named either Perdix or Talos, depending on which version of the story you follow. The nephew showed remarkable promise. According to the stories that survive, he invented the saw after observing the jagged spine of a fish, or perhaps a serpent's jaw. He was also credited with creating the first compass, fashioning it from 2 pieces of iron connected by a rivet. His mind was quick, his hands clever. And Daedalus, watching his nephew's rapid progress, felt something he had never expected to feel: jealousy. The master craftsman, celebrated across the known world, grew afraid that this boy would surpass him, that his own fame would be eclipsed by someone younger, fresher, more innovative. What happened next has been told in different ways, but all versions agree on the essential horror. Daedalus took his nephew to the Acropolis, to the high rocky outcrop that towers over Athens, or in some tellings, to the temple of Athena that stood upon it. And there, when no one else was watching, he pushed the boy over the edge. In most versions of the tale, the goddess Athena, patron of craftsmen and inventors, intervened as the boy fell, transforming him mid-plunge into a partridge so that he did not die. But the intent had been murder, and Daedalus was guilty of it. He was tried in the Areopagus, the ancient court where homicides were judged. The verdict was exile. Daedalus, stripped of his workshop and his reputation in Athens, was forced to flee. He took with him his young son, Icarus, born of a relationship with a woman whose name history has mostly forgotten, though some sources call her Crete. Together, father and son sailed across the Aegean, searching for a place that would take them in. That place was Crete. King Minos, hearing of the famous Athenian craftsman's arrival, welcomed Daedalus into his court. Here was a man whose skills could benefit the kingdom in countless ways. Minos set him to work, and Daedalus proved his worth again and again. In time, whether as reward or simply as the natural course of life in a royal court, Daedalus formed a relationship with a woman named Crete, described in the ancient sources as a slave in the service of King Minos. From this union a son was born. They named him Icarus. But Daedalus's greatest works for Minos would also become his greatest burdens. The wooden cow that helped facilitate the birth of the Minotaur, the labyrinth that imprisoned it, and finally, the thread that would allow Theseus to escape it. Each of these creations bound Daedalus more tightly to Crete until escape seemed impossible. When King Minos discovered that the Athenian prince had slain the Minotaur and escaped the labyrinth, his rage was terrible. How had it happened? How had anyone learned the secret of the maze? The answer, when it came, pointed to only one possibility: Daedalus. Whether he had willingly helped Ariadne or whether she had extracted the information through trickery, the result was the same. The architect of the labyrinth had betrayed his patron. Minos' punishment was grimly appropriate. Rather than execution, he chose imprisonment. And where better to imprison the man who had designed the labyrinth than in a tower, or in some versions, within the maze itself? Different sources place Daedalus and Icarus in different forms of captivity. Some say they were locked in a high tower overlooking the sea, others that they were sealed within the very labyrinth Daedalus had built. But all agree on one crucial detail. Minos, who controlled every ship and every port on Crete, made escape by sea impossible. For most men, this would have been the end. A comfortable prison perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. Daedalus was given food and shelter. He was not tortured. He was simply trapped, unable to return to his homeland, unable to see the wider world again. For a man of his restless genius, it must have been maddening. And in that madness, in that desperate need to be free, an idea began to form. An idea so audacious, so impossible, that it could only have come from a mind like his. If Minos controlled the sea and the land, then the escape would have to come from somewhere else. Somewhere Minos' authority did not reach. The sky. The labyrinth deserves its own moment in this telling, for it was more than mere backdrop. It was a character in its own right, a presence that loomed over everything that followed. When Daedalus set about designing the prison for the Minotaur, he created something that transcended ordinary architecture. This was not simply a building with many rooms. It was a puzzle, a trap, a physical manifestation of confusion itself. Ancient accounts describe the labyrinth as having a single entrance, but countless paths, each one seeming to lead somewhere only to curve back on itself. Corridors branched and rejoined in patterns that defied logic. Staircases led up and down in dizzying succession. Rooms opened into other rooms that looked identical, creating the illusion that one had been walking in circles, even when moving in straight lines. The very walls seemed to shift in the darkness, making it impossible to mark one's path reliably. In the center of this architectural nightmare lived the Minotaur Asterion, the bull-headed shame of King Minos. It had grown large and powerful over the years, fed on the young Athenians who were sent into the maze. The beast knew every passage, every turn. It could navigate the labyrinth by instinct, by scent, by some animal intelligence that human cleverness could not match. When tribute victims were released into the maze, they rarely lasted long. Their screams would echo through the stone corridors, bouncing off walls and making it impossible to tell where the monster was until it was too late. Daedalus had designed it all. Every false turn, every dead end, every corridor that seemed to promise escape, only to lead deeper into the maze's heart. He had made it so well that even he could barely navigate it without careful planning. This was both his pride and his curse. His greatest creation had become his greatest prison. When Ariadne came to him pleading for help, Daedalus faced an impossible choice. To refuse would mean watching Theseus die, watching Athens continue to pay its terrible tribute. But to help would mean betraying Minos, the king who had given him sanctuary when Athens had cast him out. In the end, perhaps it was empathy that moved him. Perhaps he saw in Theseus's determination something of his own refusal to accept limits. Or perhaps he simply understood that the cycle of death needed to end. The solution he provided was brilliant in its simplicity. Not a map, which would have been too complex and too suspicious if found, just a ball of thread. Ariadne would give it to Theseus, who would tie one end to the entrance and unwind it as he ventured into the labyrinth. After killing the Minotaur, he could follow the thread back like following a line drawn on a page. Simple, elegant, effective. When Theseus emerged victorious, when he sailed away with Ariadne and the freed Athenians, Daedalus must have felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, pride that his solution had worked, and fear, because he knew that when Minos discovered the truth, there would be consequences. Those consequences came swiftly. Some accounts say Minos imprisoned Daedalus immediately. Others suggest he allowed the craftsman some freedom of movement within the palace before the trap closed around him. But whether the imprisonment was sudden or gradual, the result was the same. Daedalus and his son Icarus were cut off from the world, held captive on an island where every harbor was watched, every ship accounted for, every potential route of escape blocked by the king's navy. Icarus, still young, somewhere between 13 and 18 years old based on the few details the ancient sources provide, did not fully understand the weight of their situation at first. He had grown up on Crete, had known no other home. His father's work had fascinated him, though he seems to have lacked Daedalus's skill and patience. While his father crafted wonders, Icarus played, explored, got in the way. He was restless, energetic, full of the heedless confidence of youth. But as the days of imprisonment stretched into weeks and then months, even Icarus began to feel the walls closing in. He watched his father pace their chamber, saw the way Daedalus would stand at the window for hours, staring out at the sea, at the sky, at the birds that wheeled overhead in perfect freedom. Something was brewing in that brilliant mind. Some plan was taking shape. And when Daedalus finally spoke it aloud, Icarus could barely believe what he was hearing. They were going to fly. The tower where they were held, if indeed it was a tower and not the labyrinth itself as some versions suggest, overlooked the Aegean Sea. From their window they could see ships coming and going, could watch the daily rhythms of Cretan life continue without them. Merchants sailed to and from the harbor, fishermen cast their nets. The world went on, indifferent to their captivity. For Daedalus this must have been torture of a particular kind. His hands, which had shaped so many wonders, were idle. His mind, which had solved so many impossible problems, now turned endlessly on the problem of escape. Every option seemed closed. Swim. The shores of Crete were watched, and even if they reached the water undetected, the distance to the nearest land was too great. Smuggle themselves onto a ship. Impossible, with Minos's men inspecting every vessel that left the harbor. Build a boat? With what materials and where would they hide it during construction? The answer, when it came, might have been inspired by frustration or desperation, or it might have come from simple observation. Day after day, Daedalus watched the birds, gulls and terns and petrels, riding the air currents with casual ease. They crossed distances in hours that would take a ship days to travel. They needed no harbor, no ship, no permission from any king. The air was free. At first the idea must have seemed absurd even to Daedalus. Men did not fly. It was not in their nature. The sky belonged to birds and to the gods, but Daedalus had spent his life pushing beyond what was thought possible, creating things that had never existed before. Based on what we know of his character from the myths, we can reasonably infer that he saw flight not as impossible, but merely as a problem that had not yet been solved. If birds could do it, then surely the principles could be understood, replicated, adapted for human use. He began to study the birds more carefully, watching how they moved through the air, how they angled their wings to catch the wind, how they banked and turned and rose and fell. He watched them land and take off, saw how they adjusted their bodies to compensate for gusts and shifts in the breeze. And slowly, carefully, a plan began to form. The materials were the first challenge. He needed feathers, many feathers, ranging from the small down of a bird's breast to the long flight feathers of its wings. And he needed a way to bind them together, to create a surface that would catch the air as a bird's wing does. In their captivity, Daedalus and Icarus began collecting. Every feather that drifted through their window was saved. Every bird that roosted nearby left gifts that they gathered carefully. It must have taken weeks, perhaps months, to accumulate enough. For binding, Daedalus had two materials: thread, which they obtained from blankets or clothing, and wax, which came from the candles that lit their chamber. Wax was plentiful and had useful properties. It could be softened with warmth, shaped with the hands, allowed to harden again. It would hold the feathers in place while remaining light enough not to weigh them down. As the collection of feathers grew, Daedalus began the actual construction. He sorted the feathers by size, creating gradients from small to large, just as they appeared on a bird's wing. Using a wooden frame, possibly crafted from furniture or stolen materials, he began attaching the feathers in careful rows. The smaller ones he bound with thread, stitching them to the frame. The larger flight feathers he secured with melted wax, pressing them into position and allowing the wax to cool and harden. Icarus watched this process with growing excitement. His father was building wings. They were going to escape, going to fly like the gods themselves. The boy's restless energy found new outlet in helping, in fetching materials, in holding feathers in place while his father worked. But he also slowed the work, chasing feathers that blew in the breeze, playing with the wax, softening it with his thumb and reshaping it idly. Daedalus was patient with his son, but there must have been moments when the old craftsman felt the weight of what he was attempting. This was not like his other inventions. A statue that did not work was disappointing. A tool that failed was frustrating. But these wings, if they failed, the price would be death. His death, and far worse, the death of his son. Yet what choice did they have? To remain imprisoned forever on Crete? To grow old never seeing Athens again? Never walking free under open sky? The wings took shape slowly. Daedalus built two pairs, one for himself and one for Icarus. They had to be sized appropriately, strong enough to bear a person's weight, large enough to generate sufficient lift, yet light enough to be practical. The engineering challenge was immense. Too much wax and the wings would be too heavy. Too little and the feathers would not hold. The frame had to be rigid enough to maintain the wing's shape, yet flexible enough to allow for the natural flex and give of a bird's wing in flight. Finally, after all those weeks or months of work, they were finished. Two pairs of wings, marvels of improvised engineering, lay ready. Daedalus tested them carefully, first with small movements, then with cautious flapping, building up his strength and understanding how the wings responded. He practiced in their chamber when the guards were not watching, feeling the way the feathers caught the air, learning to angle them for maximum effect. And then came the moment when he decided they were ready. He called Icarus to him, sat the boy down, and began to explain exactly what they were going to do and exactly what dangers they would face. This conversation, this final moment of instruction before the flight, would become the beating heart of the myth. For in those words of warning lay everything that would follow. The construction of the wings deserves deeper exploration, for in their making lies both the genius of Daedalus and the seeds of tragedy. Every feather had to be placed precisely. Every application of wax had to be perfect. There was no room for error, no possibility of testing the wings properly before committing to the actual escape. They would have one chance, and that chance rested on the craftsmanship Daedalus had spent a lifetime perfecting. The process began with the frames. Daedalus needed something light yet strong, something that could hold its shape under stress. Wood was the obvious choice, but not just any wood. It had to be flexible enough to bend without breaking, rigid enough to support the feathers. He shaped the frames carefully, creating a gentle curve that mimicked the natural arch of a bird's wing. The span had to be wide enough to generate lift, but not so wide that it would be uncontrollable. Once the frames were prepared, the real work began. Starting at the inner edge of each wing near where it would attach to the shoulder, Daedalus placed the smallest feathers. These were the down feathers, soft and fluffy, barely longer than a finger. He secured them with thread, stitching them to the frame in overlapping rows that would create a smooth surface. The thread work was delicate, requiring patience and precision. Each feather had to be angled correctly, had to lie flat against its neighbors, had to be secure enough that it would not come loose during flight. As he worked outward toward the wing's edge, the feathers grew larger. The transition had to be gradual, natural, matching the way feathers appear on an actual bird. Too abrupt a change, and the wing would not function properly. The air would slip through gaps, or the uneven surface would create turbulence. Daedalus worked with the skill of a lifetime spent understanding how materials behaved, how forms functioned, how function and beauty could intertwine. The outermost feathers, the primary flight feathers that would do most of the work of keeping them aloft, required special attention. These were the longest and strongest feathers they had collected, taken from the wings of gulls and other large seabirds. These could not be simply stitched in place. They needed more secure attachment, something that would hold them firmly, even under the tremendous forces they would experience during flight. This is where the wax came in. Daedalus melted the wax carefully, not too hot lest it burn and weaken, not too cool lest it fail to flow into every crevice. He worked the melted wax into the base of each large feather, pressing it around the quill, allowing it to flow and coat and bind. Then he positioned the feather on the frame and held it in place while the wax cooled and hardened. It was slow, painstaking work. Each feather had to be placed at precisely the right angle, had to overlap its neighbors in just the right way. The wax, while effective, brought with it an inherent vulnerability. Wax melts. It softens with heat. Under normal circumstances, this would not matter. The ambient temperature of the air, even in the Mediterranean sun, would not be enough to threaten properly applied wax, but there were limits. Too close to any intense source of heat, and the wax would begin to soften, would begin to give way, would begin to fail. Daedalus understood this danger perfectly. He had worked with wax his entire career, had used it for countless purposes in his craft. He knew its properties, its strengths, its weaknesses, and he knew that the sun, that great burning eye in the sky, represented a very real threat to his creation. If they flew too high, if they ventured too close to where the sun's rays were most intense, the heat could prove catastrophic. But there was another danger too, one that would be easy to overlook in concern about flying too high. Water, specifically seawater. If they flew too low, skimming the surface of the Aegean, the spray from the waves could soak the feathers. Wet feathers lose their ability to repel air efficiently. They become heavy, waterlogged, useless. A seabird can recover from this by preening and allowing its feathers to dry, but someone wearing artificial wings would have no such luxury. Once the feathers became saturated, they would begin to fail. So the wings were miracles, yes, but fragile miracles. They required perfect conditions and perfect use. They required discipline. They required following instructions exactly, with no room for deviation or experimentation. For Daedalus, experienced and thoughtful, this would not be a problem. He would fly carefully, would maintain the proper altitude, would follow the middle path between sea and sun. But for Icarus, young and impulsive, full of excitement and lacking the wisdom that comes with age, the warnings would prove harder to heed. The boy had watched his father work for weeks or months, had seen these incredible wings take shape, had imagined what it would be like to soar through the air like a bird. In his mind it must have seemed like magic, like something from a tale told by poets. The practical dangers, the engineering realities, these were abstract concepts. The thrill of flight was visceral and immediate. When the wings were finally complete, Daedalus attached them to his own body first, testing the fit, making small adjustments. The attachment had to be secure but comfortable, had to allow for full range of motion in the arms and shoulders. He had designed straps that crossed the chest and back, distributing the weight evenly. The wings themselves were surprisingly light given their size, a testament to the care Daedalus had taken in their construction. Once satisfied with his own wings, he turned to Icarus. He fitted the second pair carefully, adjusting the straps to the boy's smaller frame, showing him how they should sit, how they should feel. Icarus must have been giddy with excitement, barely able to stand still while his father worked. These were wings. He was going to fly. The imprisonment, the waiting, all of it was about to end in the most spectacular way imaginable. But first, there were instructions, warnings, rules that had to be followed. And Daedalus, looking into his son's eager young face, did his best to impress upon the boy just how serious, how vital, how absolutely critical these warnings were. The moment had come. Everything was ready. The wings were finished, tested as much as possible within the confines of their prison. The day was clear, with steady winds that would aid rather than hinder their flight. Daedalus looked at his son, at the wings strapped to the boy's shoulders, and felt a weight settle in his chest that had nothing to do with fear of falling. He took Icarus by the shoulders, looked directly into his eyes, and spoke with all the gravity he could muster. "Listen to me," he said. "Listen carefully. You must follow my path exactly. Do not deviate. Do not experiment. There is no room for error in what we are about to do. Fly at a moderate height," Daedalus instructed. "Not too low where the spray from the sea can wet the feathers and make them heavy, useless. The wings will not function if they become waterlogged. You will fall, but also not too high. The sun is a danger. Its heat will melt the wax that holds the feathers in place. Too high and the wings will come apart. You will fall. The middle path, Icarus. Always the middle path. Stay between the sea and the sun. Follow me, stay at my level, do not stray. Watch me, not the scenery. Watch me, not the birds. Keep your eyes on me and follow exactly where I lead. And one more thing," Daedalus added. "Do not look at the stars, at constellations like Ursa Major, the Great Bear, or Bootes, the herdsman, or Orion with his gleaming sword. Do not try to navigate by them. Simply follow me. I know the way. I will guide us safely." Icarus nodded, solemn, understanding the seriousness in his father's voice. He understood the warnings. Of course he understood them. How could anyone not understand such clear, simple instructions? But understanding and remembering, in the moment, with excitement coursing through your veins and wind rushing past your ears, these are very different things. They stood at the window or at the entrance to their prison, wherever it was that their captivity had held them. Daedalus went first. He spread his wings, felt them catch the air, and with a few powerful movements launched himself into space. The wings held. They worked. He was flying. The sensation must have been extraordinary beyond description. Daedalus, who had spent his life bound to the earth, who had created countless things but never experienced true flight, now felt himself borne aloft by nothing but feathers and wax and his own strength. Below him, Crete began to shrink. Ahead, the Aegean stretched blue and vast. Then Icarus launched himself, and for both father and son, the world transformed. They were escaping. They were free. They were flying. At first, Icarus did exactly as his father had instructed. He followed close behind, matching Daedalus's steady, measured wing beats. He maintained the proper altitude, neither too high nor too low, staying in that safe middle space between the hazards above and below. The wings worked beautifully. Every movement of his arms translated into motion through the air. When he angled them down, he rose. When he pulled them back, he moved forward. The mechanics were intuitive, almost natural, as if humans had always been meant to fly but had simply forgotten how. The coast of Crete fell away behind them. Ancient sources tell us they passed over islands on their journey. Samos, sacred to the goddess Hera, and Delos, birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, and Labyrinth, each one a landmark on their desperate flight northward. Fishermen on those rocky outcrops would have looked up in amazement at the impossible sight overhead. Two figures with wings, flying like birds, soaring across the sky. Those who witnessed it must have rubbed their eyes, must have wondered if they were seeing gods or heroes or some trick of the light. But no, there they were, man and boy, defying everything the world had taught about what was possible. For a while the flight continued smoothly. Daedalus led and Icarus followed, just as planned. The sun warmed their backs, but not dangerously so. The sea sparkled below, but remained safely distant. They were making good progress, flying north and west toward freedom, toward mainland Greece, toward home. But then something began to shift in Icarus. The initial nervousness of flight, the fear of falling, the careful concentration required to maintain his position, all of these began to fade as confidence grew. He was good at this. The wings obeyed his every command. He was actually flying, really and truly flying, and it was glorious beyond anything he had ever imagined. He started to test the wings a little. Small experiments, nothing dramatic. He dipped one wing and felt himself bank to the side. He pulled both wings back harder and felt himself surge forward, overtaking his father for just a moment before dropping back. He tried rising just slightly above Daedalus's level, then dropping just slightly below. The wings handled it all perfectly. And then Icarus made a mistake that countless young people have made throughout history. He began to believe that the rules did not apply to him. His father's warnings, given with such gravity and concern, started to seem overcautious, overly protective. The warnings of an old man who did not understand that these wings were strong, that the wax was secure, that nothing bad would happen if you pushed just a little bit beyond the safe boundaries. The sun called to him. That great golden orb hanging in the sky, source of all light and warmth, seemed to beckon. How glorious it must look up close. How incredible it would be to fly higher than any bird, to soar up and up until the world below became a distant abstraction, until there was nothing but sky and sun and the pure joy of flight. Icarus began to climb. Slowly at first, just a little higher than his father had specified. Then higher still. The air grew thinner, cooler even as the sun's warmth intensified. He looked down and saw Daedalus still flying at his steady, safe altitude, probably not even aware yet that his son had begun to stray. The distance between them grew. Higher and higher Icarus climbed, intoxicated by his own daring, by the sheer possibility of it all. He was doing something no mortal had ever done. He was approaching the realm of the gods themselves. The sun grew larger, brighter, more impossibly beautiful. He reached toward it as if he could touch it, as if he could grasp that golden fire in his hands. But the sun, like all things divine, does not welcome the touch of mortals. Its heat, which had seemed so pleasant at safe altitudes, now grew intense. The wax that held the feathers in place, wax that had remained solid and reliable during the initial flight, began to soften. Icarus did not notice at first. He was too caught up in the exhilaration, too focused on climbing higher still. The first feather came loose, then another, then several at once. Icarus felt a sudden instability in his left wing, a loss of lift that caused him to dip unexpectedly to one side. Confused, he looked at the wing and saw with growing horror that feathers were falling away, drifting down through the air like leaves in autumn. The wax was melting, streaming off the frame in thick golden drops. The wing was coming apart. Panic seized him. He tried to descend to get away from the sun's heat before more damage could occur, but it was too late. The structural integrity of the wings had been compromised. As he moved, as he tried to correct his flight, more feathers tore free. The right wing began to fail as well. Great gaps appeared in the coverage where there should have been smooth surfaces of overlapping feathers. Icarus called out for his father. Perhaps Daedalus heard that cry, that note of pure terror that no parent ever wants to hear from their child. Perhaps he looked back and saw his son falling, saw the feathers streaming away in the wind, saw the wings that had taken so long to build dissolving into uselessness. Icarus fell. The laws of nature, briefly suspended by ingenuity and craft, reasserted themselves with brutal finality. Without functional wings, without anything to keep him aloft, the boy plummeted toward the sea below. He had time to understand what was happening, time to feel the wind rushing past, time to know with absolute certainty that he was going to die, time to regret not listening to his father's warnings. He struck the water with tremendous force. The impact would have killed him instantly, or if not instantly, then within moments, as the sea rushed into his lungs. The feathers that had remained attached to the ruined wings scattered across the surface of the water, marking the spot where he had fallen. And then the waves, indifferent to tragedy, closed over him, and Icarus sank into the depths. Daedalus, realizing too late what had happened, circled back. He flew low over the water, calling his son's name, searching desperately for any sign of life. He saw the feathers floating on the surface, saw the wreckage of Icarus's wings, but of the boy himself there was no sign. The sea had claimed him. The ancient sources describe Daedalus's grief in different ways. Some say he circled for hours, unable to accept what had happened, calling until his voice was hoarse. Others say he landed on the nearest island immediately, determined to recover his son's body. All agree that the father's anguish was profound, absolute, the kind of sorrow that breaks something fundamental inside a person and leaves them forever changed. Daedalus continued to search, flying back and forth over the area where Icarus had fallen, until finally the body surfaced. He retrieved it with infinite gentleness, cradling his son's broken form, and flew on until he reached a small island. There, with his own hands, he dug a grave and laid Icarus to rest. The tears of a father who had tried to save his son and had instead led him to his death watered the earth that covered the boy's body. That island, which had no particular name before, became known as Icaria, in memory of the fallen boy. And the surrounding sea, where the feathers had scattered and the boy had drowned, became the Icarian Sea. These names persist to this day, geographical markers of an ancient tragedy, reminders carved into the very map of the world. After burying his son, Daedalus had to face a terrible reality. He was free, yes. He had escaped Crete and King Minos' imprisonment. But the price of that freedom had been everything. The wings that had seemed like such a triumph of human ingenuity had become instruments of death. His cleverness, his refusal to accept limitations, his determination to escape at any cost had cost him his child. What does a father do with such knowledge? How does one continue when the thing you created to save your family becomes the thing that destroys it? Though the ancient sources do not linger on Daedalus's emotional state after Icarus's burial, we can infer from the shape of the story that he must have asked himself these questions, must have replayed the entire escape in his mind, searching for the moment when things could have gone differently. Should he have tested the wings more thoroughly before committing to the flight? Should he have been more emphatic in his warnings, more severe, more frightening in his descriptions of what could happen? Should he have gone over the dangers again and again until they were seared into Icarus's memory? Or should he have recognized that his son was too young, too impulsive, too full of that careless courage that makes young people believe themselves invincible? Should he have left the boy behind and flown alone, coming back for him later with a safer plan? There were no good answers to these questions. There never are when tragedy strikes. Daedalus gathered what remained of his wings, those miraculous things that had worked exactly as designed until they had not, and continued his flight. According to different versions of the myth, he flew either to Sicily, where King Cacalus welcomed him and protected him from Minos' pursuit, or to Cumae in Italy. The Roman poet Virgil places Daedalus in Cumae, while other sources favor Sicily. But wherever he landed, he arrived as a different man than the one who had left Crete. The craftsman's hands, which had shaped so many wonders, now hung at his sides heavy with grief. The mind that had solved impossible problems could not solve this one. Icarus was dead, and no amount of cleverness or skill could bring him back. Daedalus hung up his wings in a temple dedicated to Apollo, offering them to the god as if in apology or penance. He never flew again. King Minos, learning of the escape and discovering what had happened, pursued Daedalus with single-minded determination. The king traveled from port to port, from kingdom to kingdom, searching for the craftsman who had betrayed him. He carried with him a spiral seashell and a challenge. He would reward anyone who could pass a thread through the shell's intricate chambers, an impossible task that only someone with Daedalus's ingenuity could solve. When Minos arrived in Sicily and presented the challenge to King Cacalus, the king took the shell and promised to try. He brought it to Daedalus, who solved it easily by tying a thread to an ant and allowing the ant to walk through the shell's spirals. When Cacalus presented the solution, Minos knew that Daedalus must be there. He demanded the craftsman be turned over to him. What happened next varies by source. In some versions, Cacalus' daughters, who had grown fond of Daedalus, killed Minos by scolding him to death in his bath. In others, Cacalus simply refused to give up his guest, and Minos died in Sicily without ever reclaiming his revenge. But in all versions, Daedalus remained free, protected by those who valued his gifts more than they feared Cretan wrath. Yet freedom without purpose, survival without joy, these are hollow victories. Daedalus lived on, certainly. He may have created other works, solved other problems, designed other wonders, but everything he did must have been shadowed by the memory of Icarus. Every feather he saw must have reminded him. Every time he looked up at birds soaring through the sky, he must have remembered his son doing the same, must have remembered those few glorious moments when the escape seemed to be working perfectly, before pride and youth and the sun conspired to bring it all crashing down. The ancient sources do not dwell much on Daedalus's later life. They tell us he built temples and created statues. They mention his continued travels and his eventual death, though they disagree on where and when. But the silence around his emotional state is perhaps more eloquent than any description could be. He became a cautionary figure, yes, but not in the way Icarus did. Daedalus's caution was different, the warning of what happens when you succeed at something that should never have been attempted, when your greatest triumph and your deepest tragedy become inseparable. On Icaria, the island where Daedalus had buried his son, the grave became a landmark. Sailors would point it out as they passed, telling the story to their crews, using it as a warning about the dangers of flying too high. The locals tended the grave, kept it marked, remembered the boy who had fallen from the sky. In time, the story spread across the entire Greek world and beyond. But perhaps the most poignant detail in the aftermath comes from a much later source. The poet Ovid, writing centuries after the original myth was formed, includes a small detail that captures something essential about tragedy. He describes a partridge watching from a nearby hill as Daedalus buries Icarus. The partridge beats its wings and chirps, seeming almost pleased by the craftsman's grief. Why would Ovid include such a strange detail? Because the partridge was believed to be the transformed spirit of Perdix, Daedalus's nephew, the boy he had murdered years ago in Athens out of jealousy and pride. The nephew he had pushed from the Acropolis before fleeing into exile. The crime that had started the entire chain of events leading to Crete, to imprisonment, to the desperate flight, to Icarus's death. In this reading, the partridge represents the cycle of divine justice. Daedalus had killed a young person in his care out of pride. Now he had lost his own son to a plan born of that same pride, that same refusal to accept limitations. The gods, or fate, or simple causality had come full circle. The partridge's satisfaction was not cruelty, but recognition of balance restored. Whether or not this interpretation was part of the original myth, it speaks to something important about how the Greeks understood these stories. They were not random tragedies, but interconnected moral lessons. Actions had consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, but always inevitable. The past shaped the present, and the present determined the future. To ignore this truth, to act as if one could escape the patterns woven by fate and character, was to invite disaster. The partridge watching from its low perch could be seen as a reminder that pride and jealousy extracted their price, that what Daedalus had done to his nephew had, in a circuitous way, led to what happened to his son. The story of Icarus has been interpreted in countless ways over the millennia since it was first told. At its simplest, it is a cautionary tale about disobedience. A father gives clear instructions, a son ignores them, tragedy follows. This is the reading that has been used to frighten children into compliance for generations. Listen to your parents or suffer the consequences. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper currents running through the myth. Because Icarus's story is not really about a boy who failed to obey. It is about human nature, about ambition, about the tension between safety and aspiration, between caution and courage. It asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. How high should we reach? When does confidence become hubris? What is the price of pushing boundaries, and when is that price worth paying? The most common interpretation centers on hubris, that particularly Greek concept of dangerous pride, of overstepping one's proper place in the cosmic order. The Greeks believed that mortals had their sphere and gods had theirs, and crossing between them invited divine retribution. Icarus, by flying too high, by approaching the sun, was attempting to reach beyond human limitations. He was, in a sense, trying to become more than mortal. And the universe responded by reminding him, fatally, of what he actually was. This interpretation resonated strongly in ancient Greece, where the concept of knowing your place was fundamental to social and religious life. The idea was not to discourage all ambition, but to encourage measured ambition, ambition tempered by wisdom and self-awareness. Yes, strive for excellence, yes, attempt great things, but do so with clear understanding of your limitations and with respect for forces greater than yourself. Yet there is something unsatisfying about stopping with this reading, because Icarus's flight, even if it ended in tragedy, was also an act of incredible courage and beauty. For those few moments before the fall, he was doing something extraordinary. He was experiencing a kind of freedom that no human had ever known. Is there not something admirable in that, even if it ended badly? Should we not celebrate the daring as much as we lament the foolishness? This question has led to alternative interpretations, particularly in the modern era. Some see Icarus not as a symbol of reckless pride, but as a symbol of human aspiration itself, of our species' refusal to accept limitations, our drive to explore and discover and push beyond what we have been told is possible. In this reading, the fall is tragic, yes, but the flight itself is glorious. Better to have flown and fallen than never to have flown at all. This interpretation has appealed particularly to artists, inventors and revolutionaries, people who by nature push against boundaries and conventions. They see in Icarus a kindred spirit, someone willing to risk everything for a moment of transcendence. The fact that he fell does not diminish the courage required to take flight in the first place. It simply means that greatness and tragedy often walk hand in hand. There is also a psychological dimension to the myth that has been explored extensively in modern times. Icarus represents youth itself, with all its attendant qualities, energy, enthusiasm, fearlessness, and a fundamental inability to truly internalize warnings about danger. Young people know intellectually that bad things can happen, but they do not feel it in their bones the way older people do. This is not stupidity or defiance, so much as a developmental reality. The brain's risk assessment functions do not fully mature until the mid-20s. Icarus ignored his father's warnings, not because he did not understand them, but because he could not fully believe them. His father was being overcautious, surely. The wax would hold. It had held this long, had it not? A little higher would not make such a difference. This kind of thinking is universal to youth, which is why the story resonates across cultures and centuries. Every parent has watched their child take a risk that seems obviously foolish, and every former child can remember the invincible feeling of youth, the certainty that this time would be different, that the bad outcomes happened to other people, but would not happen to them. The relationship between Daedalus and Icarus also deserves examination. Here is a father who has placed his son in extraordinary danger in order to escape imprisonment. He has built a device that, if it fails, will certainly kill them both. He gives warnings, yes, but are the warnings sufficient? Does a young person hearing "do not fly too high or the wax will melt" truly understand the life or death stakes? Can a boy who has never flown before be expected to maintain perfect discipline during his first experience of such an overwhelming sensation? Some interpretations place blame on Daedalus as much as on Icarus. The father, in his determination to escape, in his pride, in his own inventiveness, may not have fully considered whether his son was ready for such a test. He may have overestimated Icarus's maturity, underestimated the difficulty of following instructions during the excitement of flight, failed to recognize that giving someone wings and telling them not to fly too high is like giving someone fire and telling them not to get burned. In this reading, the tragedy stems not from Icarus's disobedience, but from Daedalus's flawed judgment. A truly wise man would have found another way, or would have left Icarus behind until a safer escape could be arranged, or would have designed wings that could not fail if flown too high. But Daedalus, for all his cleverness, could not see beyond his immediate goal of escape. His genius was technical, not moral or parental. There is also the feminist interpretation that has emerged in recent centuries, which points out that the entire chain of events leading to Icarus's death began with male pride and violence. Daedalus killed his nephew out of jealousy. King Minos's pride led to the birth of the Minotaur. The imprisonment and escape were all consequences of men's refusal to accept limits or consequences. And ultimately, a boy died because his father taught him to value escape and achievement over caution and survival. In this reading, Icarus is a victim not just of his own choices, but of a culture that celebrated masculine daring over feminine prudence. The environmental interpretation is more modern still, seeing in the wax wings a symbol of technology pushed beyond safe limits. Daedalus's creation worked perfectly under the right conditions, but those conditions were narrow and unforgiving. The slightest deviation, the slightest bit of excess, and the whole thing catastrophically failed. This can be read as a warning about our own technological developments, about creating tools whose failure modes are devastating, about building systems that require perfect execution, because there is no margin for error. Some philosophers have seen in Icarus a metaphor for the human condition itself. We are caught between earth and sky, between our animal nature and our spiritual or intellectual aspirations. Fly too low, stay too close to the waves, and we are diminished, reduced to mere survival, our wings waterlogged with the spray of mundane concerns. But fly too high, reach too far toward the transcendent, and we burn up, destroyed by forces we cannot withstand. The challenge of human life is to find and maintain that middle path, the balance between extremes. Religious interpretations have varied widely. Some Christian commentators saw in Icarus a symbol of those who reject God's guidance and suffer for their pride. Others saw him as representing humanity's fallen nature, our tendency to reach for divinity and fail. Still others found in the story a parallel to the Passion of Christ, with Icarus as a sacrificial figure whose death carries meaning beyond the mere fact of his fall. In literature and art, Icarus has been used to symbolize everything from failed revolutions to doomed love affairs, from artistic ambition to scientific hubris. He has been portrayed as hero and fool, as admirable and pathetic, as victim and architect of his own destruction. The myth's flexibility, its ability to carry multiple meanings simultaneously, is part of what has allowed it to survive and remain relevant for so long. Perhaps the most profound interpretation is also the simplest. Icarus is about the human need to fly despite knowing we might fall. We are creatures who dream of more than we are, who reach for more than we can safely grasp, who push against every limit we encounter. Sometimes this leads to disaster, but sometimes it leads to progress, to discovery, to breakthrough. The trick is knowing which is which, and that knowledge often comes too late. The story of Icarus has inspired artists and writers for more than 2,000 years, each generation finding new meaning in the old tale, each culture adapting it to their own concerns and aesthetics. The myth has proven remarkably durable, surviving the fall of civilizations, the rise of new religions, the transformation of the world from ancient to medieval to modern. Through all these changes, the image of a boy falling from the sky with melted wings has retained its power to move and instruct. The earliest literary source for the complete story comes from the Roman poet Ovid, writing around the time of Christ. In his Metamorphoses, a vast collection of myths organized around the theme of transformation, Ovid tells the tale with characteristic elegance and pathos. His version emphasizes the father-son relationship, lingering on Daedalus's careful instructions and Icarus's fatal disregard of them. Ovid's telling has shaped almost every subsequent version of the myth. But Ovid was not the first to mention Icarus. References appear in earlier Greek sources, though often just in passing. The tragedy playwright Euripides mentioned the story in works that are now lost. Various other ancient writers referred to Icarus and his fall as if their audiences would already know the details, suggesting the myth was well established in oral tradition before it was written down. In the visual arts, Icarus appeared on Greek pottery and Roman frescoes. These early depictions typically showed the moment of flight or the moment of fall, capturing the drama of the story in a single frozen image. The fallen Icarus became a stock figure, a shorthand for tragic youthful ambition that audiences would immediately recognize and understand. During the medieval period, when pagan myths were sometimes viewed with suspicion by Christian authorities, Icarus survived by being reinterpreted through a Christian lens. He became a moral exemplar, a warning against pride and disobedience. Medieval manuscripts illuminated with careful detail showed Icarus falling while angels or devils looked on, transforming the Greek tragedy into a Christian morality tale. The Renaissance brought a revival of interest in classical mythology and a more nuanced engagement with the story. Artists working in the humanist tradition saw in Icarus not just a warning, but a symbol of human potential and limitation. Peter Bruegel the Elder painted Landscape with the Fall of Icarus around 1560, a work that has become one of the most famous artistic responses to the myth. Bruegel's painting is remarkable for what it does not do. Rather than placing Icarus at the center of the composition, rather than making his fall the obvious focus, Bruegel shows a pastoral landscape where everyday life continues. A plowman works his field, a shepherd tends his flock. Ships sail peacefully in the harbor, and in the lower right corner, easy to miss if you are not looking for it, a pair of legs disappears into the sea. A few feathers scatter on the water. That is all. The painting's meaning has been debated for centuries. Is it about the indifference of the world to individual tragedy? Is it suggesting that Icarus's ambitious flight is ultimately insignificant compared to the enduring work of ordinary people? Is it a comment on perspective, on how what seems monumentally important to one person barely registers for another? All of these readings have merit, and Bruegel's choice to marginalize Icarus in his own story says something profound about the human condition. In literature, the Renaissance and early modern period saw numerous retellings and adaptations of the Icarus myth. Shakespeare makes references to Icarus in several plays, always using the image as shorthand for dangerous ambition. Other playwrights and poets of the era did likewise, secure in the knowledge that their audiences would understand the allusion immediately. The Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought a new interpretation of Icarus, one that emphasized the heroism of his flight rather than the folly of his fall. Romantic poets and artists, themselves often rebels against convention and authority, saw in Icarus a kindred spirit. They celebrated his daring, his refusal to accept limits, his willingness to risk everything for a moment of transcendent experience. The fall was tragic, yes, but the flight was glorious. In the 20th century, Icarus took on new dimensions. The psychologist Carl Jung discussed the Icarus myth in terms of archetypes, seeing in it fundamental patterns of human psychology. The overreaching son, the cautioning father, the tragic fall, these were not just elements of one Greek story, but patterns that appeared across cultures and times, suggesting something universal about human nature and family dynamics. Poets of the modern era returned to Icarus again and again. W.H. Auden wrote Musée des Beaux-Arts, a poem inspired by Bruegel's painting, meditating on suffering and how it occurs while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. Anne Sexton wrote To a Friend Whose Work Has Come to Triumph, a poem that celebrates Icarus's flight rather than mourning his fall. Countless other poets used the image in their own work, each finding different meanings in those wax wings. In visual arts, modern and contemporary artists have continued to engage with the myth. Henri Matisse created a series of Icarus works, including a famous cutout that shows a black silhouette against a blue background, falling stars surrounding the figure. Pablo Picasso drew Icarus multiple times, experimenting with different styles and approaches. Street artists and sculptors have created their own Icarus figures, often giving the ancient myth contemporary relevance by placing it in modern contexts. The myth has also made its way into popular culture, appearing in films, television shows, comics, and video games. Sometimes the references are direct retellings, other times just allusions or metaphors. A character flying too close to the sun, a plan that succeeds until overambition ruins it. A warning against hubris, these all invoke Icarus, whether they mention him by name or not. In science and technology, Icarus has become a reference point for ambitious projects, particularly those involving flight or space exploration. Various spacecraft and missions have been named after him, a choice that is both appropriate and somewhat ironic, given how his own flight ended. The name carries with it both the aspiration to reach for the heavens and the warning about what happens when ambition exceeds capability. Literature of the 20th and 21st centuries has seen numerous novels and stories that retell or reimagine the Icarus myth. Some stay close to the original, simply updating the language and adding psychological depth. Others transplant the essential story to new settings. A young person receives a gift or opportunity, receives warnings about how to use it safely, ignores those warnings in a moment of excitement or pride, and suffers consequences. The pattern is endlessly adaptable. Modern retellings have also begun to question the traditional interpretation. Some ask why Daedalus gave wings to someone he knew was too young to use them responsibly. Others explore Icarus's inner life, imagining what he might have been thinking and feeling during that fatal flight. Still others imagine alternative endings, worlds where Icarus heeds the warnings, or where Daedalus designs safer wings, or where the fall does not end in death, but in transformation. What all of these artistic and literary engagements with the myth demonstrate is its continuing relevance. We are still fascinated by the questions it raises. We are still moved by the tragedy of potential cut short. We are still inspired by the audacity of trying to fly. The specific details may change. The medium may evolve from pottery to painting to film to digital art, but the core story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about what it means to be human. In our contemporary world, the figure of Icarus has taken on meanings that the ancient Greeks could never have imagined, yet meanings that somehow remain true to the spirit of the original myth. The boy who flew too close to the sun has become a touchstone for discussions about everything from corporate greed to climate change, from adolescent psychology to the ethics of technological development. In the field of psychology, Icarus syndrome has become a term used to describe a particular pattern of behavior. Initial success leading to overconfidence, which leads to taking excessive risks, which ultimately leads to catastrophic failure. We see this pattern in business leaders who build successful companies only to destroy them through arrogant expansion. We see it in athletes who, after early victories, begin to believe they are invincible and take risks that end their careers. We see it in politicians who win office and then overreach, mistaking a narrow mandate for unlimited authority. The syndrome is particularly associated with youth and inexperience. Someone achieves success early, before they have developed the wisdom to handle it carefully. The success itself becomes dangerous, breeding a confidence that has not been tempered by failure or setback. They fly higher and higher, certain that the rules applying to others do not apply to them, until suddenly the wings melt and they fall. But psychologists have also noted a complementary pattern that might be called Daedalus syndrome, though this term is less common. This describes people who are so traumatized by past failures or so aware of potential dangers that they cannot act boldly when boldness is required. They build wings but are too afraid to use them. They give endless warnings but cannot inspire others to take necessary risks. In avoiding the fall, they never experience the flight. The healthy middle ground between these extremes, the balance the myth itself advocates for, is what psychologists call grounded aspiration. Dream big, yes. Strive for great things. But do so with clear understanding of risks and limitations. Listen to those with more experience. Build in safety margins. Accept that some heights are simply not reachable, at least not yet, at least not this way. This is easier to prescribe than to practice, especially for young people whose brains are literally not yet equipped to make these judgments consistently. In education, the Icarus myth has become a tool for teaching about hubris, about the importance of following instructions, about the balance between confidence and caution. But educators struggle with the message because they also want to encourage students to take risks, to try new things, to not be held back by excessive fear of failure. The challenge is teaching students to be bold without being reckless, to push boundaries without flying so high that they crash. Some educators have proposed reframing the myth entirely. Rather than focusing on Icarus's disobedience and fall, they suggest celebrating his flight, his courage, his willingness to try. In this view, the tragedy is not that he flew too high, but that his father gave him wings that could not withstand the heights he wanted to reach. The lesson becomes one about building better wings, about creating tools and systems with wider safety margins, about not asking people to perform perfectly in order to survive. In the business world, Icarus has become a cautionary figure invoked when companies or executives seem to be overreaching. The phrase, "flying too close to the sun," appears regularly in business journalism, usually describing companies that expanded too rapidly, took on too much debt, diversified into areas where they lacked expertise, or simply believed their own hype. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s and the financial crisis of 2008 were both, in their way, Icarus stories writ large. Soaring success followed by devastating falls when reality reasserted itself. Interestingly, though, Silicon Valley has sometimes embraced Icarus as a positive symbol. The tech industry prides itself on disruption, on attempting things that conventional wisdom says are impossible. Move fast and break things, as one company's motto had it. In this environment, Icarus's willingness to ignore warnings and push limits is seen as admirable. Better to try for greatness and fail than to play it safe and never know what might have been possible. The fact that Icarus fell is less important than the fact that he flew. This attitude has produced remarkable innovations, certainly, but it has also led to numerous disasters, from failed startups to dangerous products to technologies released before they were ready. The question of how much to emulate Icarus and how much to heed the warnings of Daedalus remains contested in the tech world, with different camps emphasizing different aspects of the myth. In discussions of climate change and environmental destruction, Icarus has been invoked as a symbol of humanity's relationship with technology and nature. We have created incredible tools, built wings that allow us to transform the world. But in our enthusiasm for what we can do, we may not have paid sufficient attention to the consequences. We are flying higher and higher, consuming more resources, producing more emissions, pushing ecosystems to their breaking points. The wax is melting, some environmentalists warn, and the fall is coming. The counter-argument, from those who believe technology will solve the problems technology has created, is that we should not ground ourselves out of fear. We need to fly higher still, to develop better technologies, to innovate our way out of the challenges we face. In this view, the problem with Icarus was not that he flew too high, but that his wings were not good enough. Build better wings, wings that will not melt and then fly as high as you wish. In popular culture, Icarus appears constantly, often in contexts that would surprise the ancient Greeks. Video games feature Icarus-inspired characters who fly with mechanical or magical wings, often incorporating the melting wax mechanic as a gameplay element where flying too high for too long leads to failure. Comic book heroes and villains have used Icarus imagery, sometimes as costume design, sometimes as code names, always carrying the implication of dangerous ambition. Music has embraced Icarus extensively. Songs titled Icarus appear across multiple genres, from classical compositions to heavy metal to electronic music. The metaphor translates easily to lyrics about relationships that soar too high and crash, about artistic ambitions that burn out, about any situation where someone reaches for something beautiful and falls short. The image is potent enough that even listeners unfamiliar with the specific myth understand the emotional resonance. In film and television, the Icarus story has been adapted directly numerous times and alluded to countless more. Any story about someone who achieves success only to be destroyed by their own hubris can be described as Icarian. Any narrative about a mentor figure warning a younger person who refuses to listen echoes the Daedalus-Icarus dynamic. The myth has become part of the basic vocabulary of storytelling, a pattern so fundamental that it operates even when creators are not consciously invoking it. The athletic world has its own relationship with Icarus. Athletes who push their bodies to extremes, who ignore warning signs of injury or exhaustion, who believe they can transcend normal human limitations, sometimes call to mind the boy with wax wings. The rise is spectacular, the performance is incredible, but the body has its limits, and when those limits are ignored, the fall can be devastating. Yet athletics also celebrates the Icarian spirit, the willingness to risk everything for a moment of glory, the drive to see just how high one can possibly go. In the realm of space exploration, Icarus takes on particularly poignant significance. Humanity's efforts to leave Earth, to fly higher than any bird, to reach for the stars themselves, represent the ultimate Icarian ambition. We build wings of metal and fire. We ignore those who say it cannot be done. We push against the very limits of what is possible. And sometimes we fall, as the Challenger and Columbia crews did, as numerous other astronauts and cosmonauts have throughout the history of space exploration. Yet we continue. Every space agency in the world, every private space company, everyone working to expand humanity's reach beyond our home planet, they are all in some sense descendants of Icarus. They have learned from past failures. They build better wings. They incorporate more safety measures. But ultimately they continue to fly, driven by the same impulse that drove a mythical boy to climb toward the sun. The difference is that we now have the knowledge and technology to sometimes succeed where Icarus failed. The military uses Icarus imagery as well, sometimes as warning and sometimes as inspiration. Fighter pilots, who literally fly closer to the sun than any ancient Greek could have imagined, understand intimately the balance between confidence and overconfidence, between pushing your aircraft to its limits and pushing beyond them. Many military aircraft and operations have been named Icarus, carrying both the aspiration to soar and the reminder of what happens when you fly beyond your capabilities. In addiction recovery and mental health treatment, the Icarus myth has found an unexpected application. The initial high of substance use, or the manic phase of bipolar disorder, is sometimes described as Icarian flight, a feeling of invincibility and euphoria that ignores warnings and consequences. The inevitable crash that follows mirrors Icarus's fall. Treatment involves learning to maintain a more balanced altitude, to stay in that middle space between the deadening lows and the dangerous highs. Philosophy has continued to engage with the myth as well. Existentialists have seen in Icarus a symbol of human freedom and responsibility. He made a choice, fully aware of the risks, and must accept the consequences. The fall is tragic, but also authentic, the result of genuine autonomous action rather than passive acceptance of limits. In this reading, Icarus achieves a kind of existential victory even in his death, because he chose his own path rather than having it chosen for him. Postmodern interpretations have deconstructed the myth, questioning its assumptions and biases. Who decided that flying high was hubris rather than heroism? Why should we accept Daedalus's definition of appropriate ambition? What if Icarus knew exactly what he was doing, understood the risks and chose the flight anyway, because some things are worth dying for? These readings celebrate Icarus as a rebel against authority, against limits, against the very idea that humans should know their place and stay in it. Feminist scholars have explored how the myth centers male perspectives and experiences, while marginalizing or ignoring female voices. Where is Icarus's mother in this story? What did she think of Daedalus's plan? Why do we have the stories of fathers and sons, of male ambition and male folly, but not the stories of the women who witnessed and grieved these events? Some contemporary retellings have attempted to correct this imbalance by giving voice to the silenced women of the myth. The disability rights movement has examined the myth through yet another lens, noting that Daedalus's murder of his nephew is sometimes attributed to the nephew being too clever, suggesting that difference or exceptional ability can be seen as threatening. The wings themselves can be read as assistive technology, tools that allow Daedalus and Icarus to do something their bodies could not naturally do. The tragedy is that the technology failed, that the accommodation was not robust enough, that they were forced to use an imperfect solution because imprisonment left them no better choice. In the age of social media, Icarus has become a metaphor for viral fame and its aftermath. Someone creates content that takes off, that flies higher than they ever imagined possible. The attention is intoxicating, addictive. They push for more, post more frequently, take more risks in pursuit of engagement. And then something goes wrong, a scandal or a misstep, and they crash hard. The public that lifted them up takes pleasure in their fall. The pattern repeats constantly, a cycle of rapid ascent and equally rapid descent that the ancient Greeks would have recognized immediately. Entrepreneurs and startup founders see themselves in Icarus sometimes proudly. They are attempting something difficult, something established players say cannot be done. They ignore the naysayers, the cautious voices telling them to be realistic. They build their wings and they fly. Some succeed and some fail, but all of them, at least in their own minds, are continuing the tradition of daring ambition that Icarus represents. The question is whether they remember the lesson about limits, or whether they only remember the thrill of flight. Climate activists have adopted Icarus as a symbol in a different way. They see humanity as a whole in the role of Icarus, flying high on fossil fuels and consumption, ignoring the warnings from scientists who play the role of Daedalus. The sun represents the tipping point, the moment when the damage becomes irreversible, and we are flying closer and closer, confident that we can turn away at the last moment, that our wings will hold just a little longer. The activists' message is urgent. Listen to the warnings while there is still time, turn away from the sun before the wax melts and we all fall together. In discussions of artificial intelligence and advanced technology, Icarus appears as a warning about developing capabilities we cannot control. We are building systems more powerful than we fully understand, reaching for abilities that seem godlike. The warnings from AI safety researchers echo Daedalus's warnings to Icarus. Proceed carefully, maintain strict limits, do not let enthusiasm overcome caution. But the technology companies, driven by competition and profit, and the sheer excitement of what they are creating, keep flying higher. The educational testing industry has even produced an Icarus effect, describing students who perform well on initial assessments and become overconfident, then perform poorly on subsequent harder tests because they did not prepare adequately. The early success gives them false confidence in their abilities, and they fly higher than their actual skill level can sustain. The solution, educators suggest, is helping students develop accurate self-assessment and consistent study habits, rather than relying on natural talent or initial easy victories. In medical ethics, Icarus appears in discussions about experimental treatments and cutting-edge procedures. How far should medicine push? When does life-saving innovation become reckless experimentation? The doctors and researchers are Daedalus, building wings to escape the prison of disease and death. But patients who undergo experimental treatments, especially when conventional options remain, are taking an Icarian risk. Sometimes it works beautifully, sometimes the wings melt and the fall is terrible. The ethical challenge is ensuring that patients understand the risks, that their decision to fly is informed and genuine. What all of these modern applications demonstrate is that the Icarus myth has become more than a story. It has become a conceptual framework, a way of understanding certain patterns of behavior and certain types of tragedy. When we say someone flew too close to the sun, we invoke thousands of years of cultural understanding. We are not just describing what happened, but placing it in a larger context of human nature and human limitation. The myth endures because the tension it describes is eternal. We are ambitious creatures. We want to go higher, to do more, to transcend our limitations. But we are also finite creatures, bounded by physical laws and natural limits. The challenge of human existence is navigating the space between these two truths, being bold enough to try difficult things without being so reckless that we destroy ourselves in the attempt. Icarus fell, yes, but for a moment, for one glorious moment, he flew. And that flight, that brief impossible triumph over gravity and limitation, that is what humanity remembers most clearly. Not the fall, which was tragic but predictable. The flight, which was magnificent and unprecedented. Perhaps that is the real lesson of the myth after all, not the warning about hubris, though that is there and valid, but the inspiration, the demonstration that humans can accomplish seemingly impossible things, that we can build wings from nothing but feathers and wax and determination, that we can fly. The falls will come. They are inevitable when you push boundaries and test limits, but without the willingness to risk falling, we would never rise at all. We would remain earthbound, safe but diminished, surviving but not living. Icarus reminds us that there is value in the reaching, even when the reach exceeds our grasp. There is meaning in the attempt, even when the attempt ends in failure. There is glory in the flight, even when the flight ends in a fall. As our story comes to an end, we are left with an image that has haunted imagination for millennia. A boy falling from the sky, feathers scattering on the wind, wax dripping into the sea below. A father circling overhead in anguish, calling a name that will never be answered. An island grave and a sea named for the fallen. A myth that begins in imprisonment and ends in freedom of a sort, though the price of that freedom was more than anyone should have to pay. The tale of Icarus is many things. It is a warning about the dangers of disobedience, about ignoring the wisdom of those with more experience. It is a meditation on the relationship between fathers and sons, on the difficulty of keeping those we love safe when they are determined to take risks. It is an exploration of human ambition and human limitation, of the drive to transcend our nature and the inevitable consequences when we push too far. But perhaps most importantly, it is a story about flight, about the human dream of soaring above the earth, of seeing the world from a perspective no one had seen before, of experiencing a kind of freedom that seems almost divine. That dream is as alive today as it was in ancient Greece. We still build wings, though now they are made of aluminum and composite materials rather than feathers and wax. We still fly toward the sun, though now we do so in spacecraft that can withstand temperatures that would have instantly melted Icarus's wings. We have learned from his fall. We build in redundancies and safety systems. We test exhaustively before committing to the full flight. We have protocols and procedures designed to prevent the kind of impulsive decision that killed Icarus. Yet we still fly, and sometimes we still fall, because the desire to reach higher, to go farther, to see what lies beyond the next horizon, that desire is fundamentally human. It has driven us from the caves to the moon and will drive us, eventually, to the stars. Icarus failed, but his failure taught us how to succeed. Every aviation pioneer who died testing their aircraft, every astronaut lost in the attempt to reach space, every person who pushed past known limits and paid the ultimate price, they are all part of the same tradition. They flew too close to the sun and fell, but their flights mapped the boundaries, showed us where the dangers lay, taught us how to build better wings. And so the myth endures, retold and reinterpreted with each generation, each culture finding new meanings in the old story. Icarus has been a symbol of hubris and heroism, of folly and ambition, of youth and pride and the terrible cost of pushing limits. He has appeared in poetry and painting, in film and literature, in psychology textbooks and business case studies. His name has been given to spacecraft and songs, to syndromes and software programs. He has become, in a sense, immortal, more lasting than bronze or stone. The island of Icaria still exists in the Aegean Sea, a beautiful place of mountains and valleys, of villages clinging to hillsides and beaches where the waves still lap at the shore. Tourists visit, drawn by the myth, walking the land where legend says Daedalus buried his son. The Icarian Sea still bears its name, its waters unchanged by the passage of centuries, still reflecting the same sun that melted those ancient wax wings. In those waters, no trace remains of the boy who fell. The feathers have long since scattered or sunk. The wax dissolved into nothing. Even the bones, if they were ever really there, have become part of the seafloor, indistinguishable from stone. All that remains is the story, passed down through generation after generation, transformed and adapted, but never forgotten. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps what matters is not the physical reality of a boy who may or may not have existed, but the truth the story tells about human nature. We are creatures who dream of flying. We build wings however we can, from whatever materials we have. We launch ourselves into the air despite the danger, despite the warnings, despite knowing that the fall, when it comes, will be terrible. We do this because we must. Because staying earthbound, staying safe, accepting our limitations without testing them, that is not living. That is merely existing. Icarus lived. For one brief span of time, he truly lived, experiencing something no human before him had ever experienced. And when he fell as someone who had dared greatly, who had reached for something beyond himself, who had chosen risk over safety and glory over survival. Was it worth it? That is a question each person must answer for themselves. Daedalus, grieving over his son's grave, might have said no. The cost was too high. The flight should never have been attempted. Better to remain imprisoned but alive than to seek freedom and find death. But Icarus, in those last moments before the fall, in those glorious heights when he was higher than any human had ever been, when the sun filled his vision and the world spread out below him like a map, might have given a different answer. Perhaps there are things worth flying for, even if the flight ends in falling. Perhaps there are heights worth reaching for, even if the reaching destroys us. Perhaps the true tragedy would be to have wings and refuse to use them, to remain forever earthbound out of fear of the sky. These are the questions the myth asks us, questions we must each answer in our own way. And as long as humans dream of flying higher, of reaching farther, of testing the limits of what is possible, the story of Icarus will remain relevant. It will continue to be told, to be painted, to be sung, to be retold in new forms and new media. The boy who flew too close to the sun will continue to fall again and again across the centuries. And we will continue to watch, to remember, to learn. Or perhaps, like Icarus himself, to forget the warnings in our excitement, to believe that this time will be different, that our wings are stronger, that we can fly just a little bit higher without consequence. That too is human. That too is part of the story. The sun still shines in the Mediterranean sky. The sea still glitters below. And somewhere in the realm of myth and memory, a father still grieves for his son, while a boy forever falls, suspended in that eternal moment between flight and failure, between aspiration and tragedy, between the highest heights and the deepest depths. Remember his name, remember his flight, remember his fall. And when you face your own moment of choice, when you hold your own wings and contemplate your own sky, think of Icarus. Learn from him if you can, but do not let fear of falling prevent you from learning to fly. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of mythology's most enduring tales. If you enjoyed tonight's exploration of Icarus and his fatal flight, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button to let me know you'd like to hear more stories from the rich world of Greek mythology and beyond. And if there is a particular myth or legend you would like me to cover in a future video, leave a comment below. I read them all, and your suggestions help guide the direction of this channel. Until next time, dream well, fly safe, and remember that the middle path between the sea and the sun is often the wisest course. But sometimes, just sometimes, the view from the heights is worth the risk of falling. Good night.